After several weeks of deliberations and multiple plans, the U.S. government has finally approved a bill on debt spending. The plan, signed by President Barack Obama on Tuesday, allows the debt ceiling to be raised and secure borrowing through 2012. In addition, the measure would decrease spending by $2 trillion over the next decade. Joining me now to shed more light on the situation is Chris Casteel, the Oklahoman's Washington bureau chief. And Chris, neither side seems satisfied with the final outcome. Was this a situation where the parties finally agreed to disagree to avoid default?
Yes, exactly. I mean, they finally agreed to the political reality that they were out of time. They had spent weeks and months really talking about, some of the big issues. Could they have a big plan that cut $3 trillion and maybe had another $1 trillion in tax increases? Well, talks like that broke down a couple of different times. Then you had last week where really it was just nothing but political posturing. The House spent almost a week on a bill that wasn't ultimately going to be passed by the Senate or signed by the President, and the Senate ran down the clock into Saturday night, and you really had a concern about Sunday night. That's what some of the leaders said. Like, we got to get this done Sunday night because the overseas market's open, and we don't want them to tank. So really what it took was to address the two, all the big questions by then were off the table. They're probably not going to have tax increases, probably not going to have a real discussion about Medicare, Social Security reform. We've got to decide a couple of key things. One, how long are we going to raise this debt ceiling for? Is it going to be 6 months? We're going to be back here doing this again in 6 months, or we're going to do it all through, raise it enough so the government can borrow enough money all through 2012? And number two, how much in cuts and how are we going to enforce them? So that's really what the negotiations came down to over those last few hours. There really was, I think, a fear on the parts of some of the veteran leaders around here about what could happen on Tuesday if they didn't get this done. So everybody acknowledged by then, hey, we've got divided government, we've got Democratic Senate, Republican House, and there's even arguments within those, two bodies. And a Democratic president, nobody's going to get what they want. We got to get something, cobble something together quick. Nobody's going to like it, but it's got to be done. So, right, that's what happened.
How has this process affected the public's image of the government and their parties, and the president's image?
I just don't even think you could understate how much damage they did to themselves. There was a poll done by the Washington Post and Pew Research Center where they asked people, just come up with one word, name one word to describe this, and the top word was ridiculous. I think disgusting was up there, pretty high. And then CNN had a poll where 77% of those polled said that they acted like spoiled children. So, there's all this, who are the winners, who are the losers. Well, but really, nobody came out looking that good in this thing. I mean, in fact, they came out looking terrible. And this is the second time this year they've done it. They a few months ago in March, they had taken it to the brink to keep the government running. Now they take it to the brink, to not default on the debt and send out Social Security checks and military. I mean, this past Saturday, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top uniformed military person in our country, was in Afghanistan talking to the troops. The number one question the troops asked him were, are we going to get paid next week? So, how do you think the American people probably viewed that?
Oklahoma politicians have already come out against the deal. Is this a plan that will continue over the next few years, or will Republicans and Democrats alike try to form a new plan after the 2012 elections?
That's actually a really good question. And to be fair, the Republicans in the delegation, in the Oklahoma congressional delegation, actually split on this. The 4 Republican House members voted for it, and the only Democrat in the delegation voted for it, and Senator Jim Inhofe, Senator Tom Coburn voted against. So it's not like there was unanimity even among the Oklahomans about this deal. But it's a good question about the later years. I mean, you do have these fights coming up over how to cut this remaining $2 trillion, or up to $1.5 trillion, I guess, is the minimum, and those are going to happen around Thanksgiving and Christmas. But it is a good question about the later years, because this is a deal that supposedly will cap spending for 10 years. And as Senator Coburn has said, you really can't tie Congress's hands that far in the future. They can, a new Congress can come back in and change the law, change the mechanics of this whole thing, and this whole deal is unraveled. But the bigger question really about that is that what they have done is just kind of tinkering around the edges anyway. I mean, everybody knows that the big drivers in government spending are programs like Medicare, and what are needed there, according to the leaders, are what are called structural changes. Not just saying we're going to cut $500 billion this year from or something, but really changing the rules of the game, because they're exploding in costs. They're just almost completely out of control. So really what's going to happen is you're going to have to get in there and say, okay, people are going to pay more and get less, and there are going to be these kinds of changes to hospitals and doctors and everything. And that's really a lot of detailed work that Congress has to do, and that hasn't been done. And so that is really the kind of work that has to be done in the future, which is just kind of really hard legislative work on entitlement programs.
Casteel from the Oklahoman's Washington Bureau, thank you very much. And you can read more on the debt legislation online at newsok.com and continuing coverage in the Oklahoman.